Okay, well, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Donald Sloan and I'm chair of the Oxford Cultural Collective. I'm in London and I'm joined from Puerto Vallarta in Mexico by my friend and colleague, the legendary restaurateur and chef Jeremiah Tower. Now, this is part of a series of discussions that I'm having with the Oxford Cultural Collective patrons. We're calling it Eating, Drinking, Thinking. And of course, each of them is distinguished in their own fields. And in these conversations, we're going to be exploring their professional contributions and also their influence in the world of food and hospitality. So Jeremiah Tower, it's a real privilege to have Jeremiah here. Jeremiah is widely regarded as the father of modern American cooking. He's also America's first celebrity chef. He began his career in hospitality back in the early 70s, co-owning Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California with Alice Waters. In 1984, he opened Stars Restaurant in San Francisco, which went on to have a profound impact on US hospitality and taste. It was the go-to destination, as its name would suggest, for leading cultural figures of the age, everyone from Luciano Pavarotti and Rudolf Nureyev to Liza Minnelli and Joe DiMaggio. He left the world of hospitality in 2000, ultimately moving to Mexico, where he still lives, and living for much of that time in relative obscurity. But in 2017, the film The Last Magnificent, it's a great and very appropriate title, which tracks his life and work, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City, and that has brought him back into the international spotlight. So Jeremiah, great to see you as always. How are things in Mexico?
Just fine, apart from the situation, of course. But I always believe that chaos brings great opportunity. So we're looking forward to the future here.
Well, that may be something that we touch on in this conversation, but let's go right back to the beginning of your career in food, which in a sense was an unlikely career because you were actually trained at Harvard as an architect, but you joined Alice Waters in 1972 at Chez Panisse, and very quickly you co-owned the restaurant and you had taken control of the kitchen. For an untrained chef, again, seems fairly an unlikely move, but was your ability to do this really a product of your rather remarkable upbringing that you'd had, would you say?
Yes, I think it was, because what I found out, I was left alone the first day I ever cooked professionally, and I was made the head chef of Chez Panisse. Fortunately, I had no idea what that meant, otherwise I would have run a mile. But I just thought, well, I've tasted all these dishes that, from French Provincial Cooking by Elizabeth David, which was the Bible of the kitchen. I cooked my way through it. I tasted that food in France. And I found out that I had been blessed with a taste memory. So even though I didn't know how to cook it without reading a recipe perhaps, then at least I knew how it should taste. And with the recipe, if you don't know how it should taste, it's not much good. But if you've got the recipe and you do know how it should taste, you're off to a flying start.
Now you hinted there at the fact that the Bible of Chez Panisse was Elizabeth David's work, and indeed Chez Panisse developed a reputation for French and Mediterranean cuisine. But there seemed to be a turning point. 1976, I think it was, you held this Californian regional dinner, which, I mean, nowadays it might seem fairly innocuous, that one dinner could end up having could end up being such a turning point. But what was the significance, would you say, of this particular event?
Well, it was the result of having spent a few years trying to cook French provincial cooking, French country cooking, and then finding the ingredients. In those days, to be a serious restaurant, which Chez Panisse was by 1976, or at least considered that, you had to have foie gras and duck and all that sort of thing, and Dover sole. But of course, those are all frozen or canned or something. And fortunately, we couldn't afford them anyway, and I didn't want them anyway. So beating my head against that wall of trying to find the perfect ingredients for French food, I thought, wait a minute, I've got these fresh prawns from Monterey Bay, and I've got ducks up in Sonoma, and we started raising things for ourselves. And I thought, why not just celebrate what we're doing here, which is in California? So I called it the California Regional Dinner. The menu was in English for the first time. The wines were all Californian for the first time. And it really grabbed people's imagination, especially the press in New York.
So something that we take relatively for granted these days, both in the US and the UK and elsewhere, this idea of celebrating local ingredients that are in season, that are fresh and so on, hadn't particularly been done before. So this was the beginning of what became known as the American food revolution, would you say?
Yes, that's exactly what happened, because suddenly people thought, you know, in the film, The Last Magnificent, one of the great chefs in the United States who worked at Stars actually said, you know, suddenly Jeremiah said, we don't need Dover sole, we've got petrale sole from the San Francisco Bay. We don't have to have Bourdain oysters. We've got fabulous oysters here, and to hell with, you know, the French product. We've got it right next door.
And what a boost to the confidence of a community of producers and winemakers and chefs, that realization that what you have locally could be celebrated. But you mentioned Stars there, and you left Chez Panisse in 1978 and had, you know, a famously tempestuous relationship in the latter years at Chez Panisse with Alice Waters. But you had some time between 78 and 84 where you worked in various places, including the Santa Fe Bar and Grill. But when it came to Stars, which was your own project for the first time, what was your vision for Stars? What were you hoping to achieve?
Well, you know, I'd grown up in England and the United States and France, and so I was in love with brasseries, great big restaurants in New York, like Luchal's, Brasserie and La Coupole in Paris, and just the beginning of brasseries in London. I mean, I went into Brasserie one night, and there were two models sitting right by the entrance with long red fingernails, and they were scooping oysters and crab meat out, and they were there when we arrived and there when we left. And they were as thin as rails, and they were eating the biggest seafood servers I'd ever seen. And I thought, one of these days, I want a restaurant just like that. And so I wanted a restaurant where people would come 3 or 4 days a week, you know, once a month or once every 3 months. So it was a big bar, and it was everybody from, as you said, you know, Pavarotti and Nureyev, and the stars of Hollywood, to, you know, prom couples coming in underage and sneaking champagne.
And it's interesting that, you know, it had such an effect that the term revolution was applied to the influence of Stars. Now, it's maybe difficult for you to talk yourself about what influence you had, but looking back, even if you have to look through the eyes of others, how would you articulate the influence of Stars on US hospitality?
Well, Johnny Apple from the New York Times, the late Johnny Apple, said it was the most democratic restaurant in the United States. So at one point you could have, you know, Daniel Steele in $250,000 worth of clothes and $2 million worth of jewelry. And as I said, next to them I put a prom couple, you know, and fed them champagne so they wouldn't be arrested. And it was that kind of feeling. So people came to see who was there. And the people like Daniel Steele were always amused by her fans around her, you know. So the influence was that you could have a big, bustling brasserie kind of restaurant that was famous and full all the time. It didn't have to be serious. It didn't have to have maitre d's and black tie and all that sort of thing. So it was fun instead of just being serious.
And not just for special occasions. And it was really then, yes, the democratization of dining in the US, but the revolution was as much about lifestyle as it was about food.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it was all about lifestyle. I mean, and you know, it was my role, one of my roles was to convince everyone to buy me champagne every night. But my model there was Peter Langen, because I loved Langen's brasserie, and that was one of the models for Stars.
Yeah. There's something that's interesting also about the fact that you were not a trained chef. I mean, much like, well, there are many who've gone on to have great influence who were not trained in the traditional sense. Raymond Blanc in the UK is a fine example. But did you feel, in a sense, that because you hadn't come through that rather regimented, almost militaristic training that is typical in kitchens, especially French kitchens, you were unconstrained. You were free to do whatever the hell you wanted at Stars.
Well, it was terrifying in the beginning when I realized I didn't know what I was doing about anything.
The theme, if you don't mind saying this, I didn't know what I was doing yet.
Well, I didn't. But then, of course, when I got a little bit of success and I was working, people kept coming back. I'm talking about Japanese. I just thought, well, I mean, as long as I don't know anything, I might as well just keep doing this because it looks like it's working. Exactly. And then at Stars, of course, you know, I mean, we just made up our own rules.
Yeah, well, it certainly worked, whatever rules you made up. I mentioned this move from Stars, you know, that came in the late 90s, and you went off, lived for a while in the Philippines, you lived in Italy, and ultimately settled where you are now in Mexico. It seems a strange move, you might think, for somebody who was so successful to suddenly vanish from the scene and live, as I said in the introduction, in relative obscurity. What brought this change on, this desire to move out of the spotlight? And it was the spotlight that you were in.
Well, a great heroine of mine, Greta Garbo, said, she did not say, I want to be left alone. She said, I don't want to be alone. That's not what she said. She said, I want to be left alone. And I thought, you know, obscurity is the basis for a great comeback, and that's why I did it. Also, I've been talking to 350 people a day, shaking hands with 350 people a day for, you know, 25 years. It was time to go to the beach.
Yeah. So, well, it's perfectly logical. So you had your Garbo moment, which lasted for 14 years or so, and you, as I also said earlier, you began to emerge from obscurity. You first of all updated your autobiography, and this second edition, I've got a copy here, Start the Fire, which if those watching haven't read, they really should, because it's a real tell-all of your life and your friendships and much more. And that, of course, is published by Anthony Bourdain, an imprint of HarperCollins, and Anthony Bourdain is key to this story. But before I talk about your particular working partnership and your relationship with Anthony Bourdain, of course, he passed away 2 years ago, tragically, and you and I were actually together in New Orleans when we heard the sad news that he had died. But what was your assessment of the man and of his impact in the food world and beyond?
Well, you know, when everybody first read Kitchen Confidential, it was, you know, hilarious all the way through it, shocking and wonderful. So he became a hero then to anybody who was cooking in any restaurant anywhere. But he was one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. But it wasn't just intelligent, he could actually articulate what was in his head. Now, I mean, a lot of us try and articulate like that, but he was a genius at it. He was a magician of a one-liner, you know, for TV. Any
examples?
Oh, well, I was wondering whether I should say this one. But,
it's only us talking, yeah.
You know, live morning news television, they knew how good he was with a one-liner and a comeback, so they tried to trip him up occasionally. One morning on CBS, a woman said, well, would you prefer, you know, great sex or a great meal? And he said, well, it depends who's doing the fucking cooking.
Well, that kind of sums it up, doesn't it? Yeah. So Bourdain obviously got in touch with you. You worked on the autobiography, and it seems that the autobiography is almost the framework, the model for the film, The Last Magnificent. Now, it's quite something when someone comes to you and says, I want to make a film of your life. I mean, how did this come about, and what was Bourdain's motivation?
Well, the Start the Fire was actually a California dish originally in Start the Fire. Well, Eater said it was one of the top 20 culinary memoirs of all time. Huge exaggeration, but it was a very nice thing to put on the cover, you know.
Yes.
So Tony Bourdain thought that perhaps I hadn't got the credit that I was due, and he read the book and said, and told Lydia Tonalia, who's the head of, co-head of Zero Point Zero, the film company in New York that made all his TV films. And he said, read this, we have to make a movie of it. So she read it and said, we're not making a movie. I can't stand that person called Jeremiah Tower. I hated that book. That, you know, that he's so arrogant. And then Tony said, well, of course, how do you think he did what he did? Without, you know, so she finally accepted to do the movie. And then Tony produced it, and CNN owns it. And we had you know, for 2 years, we made the movie.
And what about the process? I mean, how actively involved were you in telling the story, or did you stand back from it and say that's the producer's responsibility?
I had a meeting with Lydia Tonalia in San Francisco. It was supposed to be half an hour, just to, you know, give me a test on camera. And it lasted 6.5 hours. And so we were pretty committed by the end of that. And I said to her, I have 2 demands. 1, that we take the high road with Alice Waters. And 2, that I have absolutely nothing to do with the content, because I don't know anything about this process either. And she said, well, that's very interesting, because those are the 2 demands we were going to ask of you. So then we went to New York, and we set up in the studio, and I was drinking champagne, and she looked at me and said, tell me about your father. I said, he was a prick. I went, oh my God, what did I just say? He said, well, if we can start there, we've got a movie.
There you go. And what about the you know, seeing yourself? We actually did a screening in the UK, before which I interviewed you in front of a large audience. But that sort of the idea of looking at yourself on the big screen and this movie being about you, what impact did that have on you?
Well, it was absolutely terrifying. I mean, very, very strange to watch yourself on the big screen if you've never done it before. So at the Tribeca Film Festival, I had never seen it.
Yeah.
And Lydia
even more frightening than, yeah.
Took me to the premiere and said, I hope you're speaking to me after this is over. And I said, well, let's sit in the back in case they hate the movie. And then in the first 10 minutes, well, it wasn't 10, probably 3 or 4 minutes, it was dead silence, because the film opens with a very strange line from me. And so I leaned over to her and I said, Lydia, let's get out of here. They hate this fucking movie. And a woman behind me heard and burst out laughing, and then the whole theater burst out laughing. And, you know, there was a 15-minute standing ovation at the end, and I thought, okay, well, now we're in business.
Now, sorry, go on.
But very strange to see. I mean, half the time I had to put my hand over my eyes and not listen. You know, it's definitely very strange.
Well, yours is a story that deserves to be told. So if there's anyone out there that hasn't seen it, they should get onto Netflix and certainly watch it. It's a fabulous movie. The last section of The Last Magnificent deals with a decision you took, which was to come out of retirement as a chef and take up a position take over Tavern on the Green in New York. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, was that a big mistake? And what drove you to that decision?
Taking on the job at Tavern on the Green was not a big mistake, because I survived it.
Yeah.
And so did the restaurant. It actually started to get some good reviews in the New York newspapers, but the owners were incompetent, and New York is a ruthless place. And in fact, Anthony told me, I mean, that was a hopeless cause. You could never have made a success for that place. I said, well, why the hell didn't you tell me that in the beginning, you know?
It's a bit late. Yes.
But also, I mean, I can't resist a great challenge, and that was one of the greatest challenges ever. But they also paid me $350,000 a year.
Well, there we are. If any other excuse was required, yeah, that's it. Yes. Now, we've been talking about your success and your influence, but obviously we're both immersed in an industry, the hospitality industry, and also the world of food generally. And we're recording this in June 2020. The hospitality industry worldwide has been going through a terrible time as a result of the public health crisis, the coronavirus pandemic. And we're by no means through this yet, as you and I speak. Of course, we could focus, Jeremiah, on the negatives of this, and there are many, but Can you see anything positive from this phase? I mean, can you see that the industry might be able to emerge with a more creative spirit or with more resilience? What might we take from this that's positive?
Well, I'm certainly glad that I'm not a restaurant owner right now. But for all the young people in the hospitality industry, restaurant industry, I can say, you know, this is a very exciting time. You have to look at it that way. After the Black Death and the plagues of Europe was the Renaissance, for God's sake. You know, I mean, think about that for a second. So this is an opportunity to remake the hospitality and culinary world and not rely on all the old trends and fads and everything. So you can just, you know, sweep your minds clean. I'm talking to the young culinarians and cooks and restaurant workers and waiters and everybody. Sweep your mind clean and inherit the earth, you know, inherit that part of the world that we love so much, because it's up to you. It's not up to any of your heroes. They're probably struggling to think how to survive, but you are the survivors.
It's a positive message. I mean, it almost sounds as if it's time for a second revolution in the hospitality world after that which you started. You're talking there also about young people, and again, something else that ties you and I together is a focus on young people and on teaching and so on. What would your advice be? I mean, it might be a time when people are feeling put off entering the world of food and hospitality, but for those who are venturing into this as their career, what would your advice be to those in that position?
I would say be fearless, jump in and realize that you can be the next heroes and the revolutionaries. You can be the next stars of the world. So don't think that you have to, your success is going to be because you're copying trends, TV, cooking shows, magazines. Do your own thing. Sit back, read all the sources that you really respect, think about it, and then go for it. Just take the bit in your mouth and run.
Well, Jeremiah, it's always good to end on a positive note, and that's certainly a positive note. So great to see you as always. Hopefully, when this difficult period is over, it won't be too long before I can see you face to face, not via Zoom. But thank you very much, and we'll catch up soon. Thank you, Jeremiah.
Thank you, and I'll see you for lunch at Quo Vadis.
Quo Vadis is missing us both, I think, yeah.
Okay, thank you.